They had dug in everywhere, but we flushed them out, inch by inch. The jungle floor beneath my boots was soft with decay and blood, and somewhere in the green hell ahead of us, another Japanese soldier was waiting to die for his emperor. I could hear my breathing inside my helmet, sharp and quick, while the weight of my Thompson submachine gun seemed to grow heavier with each step forward. Behind me, 23 men of the 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company, moved like ghosts through the morning mist that clung to the mountainsides of northern Luzon. It was January 1945, and we were about to begin the largest land campaign in Pacific theater history, a campaign that would cost the Japanese Emperor 65,000 of its finest soldiers before we were through. The landing at Lingayen Gulf had been almost too easy. On January 9th, our convoy of 800 ships stretched across the horizon like a steel city floating on the South China Sea. General MacArthur stood on the bridge of the USS Boise, watching his promise to return to the Philippines finally come true. I was just a 22-year-old second lieutenant from Ohio, but even I understood we were witnessing history. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at our invasion fleet, kamikaze attacks that seemed to come from every direction, suicide boats packed with explosives, even swimmers with limpet mines. But we had made it through, and now 200,000 American soldiers were pouring onto the beaches of Luzon. The initial push inland had been swift. Our division, the 6th Infantry, moved through the coastal plains like a spearhead, supported by Sherman tanks and artillery that could level entire villages in minutes. But I knew it wouldn't last. The Japanese had learned hard lessons from their defeats across the Pacific. General Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who had crushed the British in Singapore, was waiting for us in the mountains with over 200,000 troops. He had no intention of dying uselessly on some beach. Instead, he had turned the entire island into a fortress, with every ridge, every valley, every cave system transformed into a killing ground. By the end of January, we had advanced nearly 100 miles inland, but the real fighting was just beginning. The Japanese had withdrawn into 3 massive defensive positions, the Shobu Group in the north, the Kembu Group defending Clark Field, and the Shimbu Group protecting the approaches to Manila. Each position had been prepared for months, with interconnected bunkers, spider holes, and tunnel systems that seemed to go on forever. They had stockpiled ammunition, medical supplies, and food for a siege that could last years. But they had miscalculated one thing. They were fighting Americans, and we don't quit. The first time I saw what we were really up against was on February 3rd, when my platoon was ordered to take Hill 394, a seemingly insignificant piece of high ground about 15 miles north of San Jose. The hill looked like nothing special from our positions in the valley below, just another jungle-covered slope in a landscape full of them. But our intelligence reports indicated it was a key observation post for Japanese artillery, and division wanted it cleared before we moved deeper into the mountains. We started our assault at dawn, moving up the steep trail in single file, with Sergeant Murphy leading the point squad and me bringing up the rear with the radio operator. The jungle was alive with the sounds of insects and birds, and the air was thick with humidity that made our uniforms stick to our skin. For the first 100 yards, everything seemed normal. Too normal. "Lieutenant," Murphy whispered into his radio, "something ain't right up here." He was crouched behind a massive mahogany tree, his rifle pointed up the trail. I moved forward carefully, staying low until I could see what had stopped him. The path ahead curved around a rocky outcropping, disappearing into shadows that seemed too dark for the time of day. There were no sounds coming from that direction. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. "What do you think?" I whispered. Murphy had been fighting in the Pacific since Guadalcanal, and his instincts had kept him alive through 3 major campaigns. He studied the terrain ahead with the intensity of a man whose life depended on reading the signs correctly. "They're up there, sir. Probably been watching us since we left the valley." That's when I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of calling for artillery support or requesting airstrikes, I decided to push forward with the platoon. We were young, we were confident, and we had been winning battles across the Pacific for 3 years. How much fight could a handful of Japanese soldiers really have left? "Spread out," I ordered over the radio. "First squad takes the right flank, second squad up the middle, third squad left. Move slow and watch for booby traps." We advanced in a skirmish line, every man alert for the slightest sign of danger. The jungle pressed in around us, vines and branches catching at our equipment, roots and fallen logs making every step treacherous. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain the enemy could hear it. Sweat ran down my face and stung my eyes, but I didn't dare wipe it away and take my hands off my weapon. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Private Jensen, who had been walking point for the second squad, simply crumpled to the ground without a sound. Then the hillside exploded with muzzle flashes and the distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles. Japanese voices screamed commands in their harsh language, and suddenly the air around us was filled with bullets that buzzed and whined like angry wasps. "Take cover," I shouted, though my men were already diving behind trees and rocks. The volume of fire was incredible, far more than we had expected from what intelligence had told us was a small outpost. These weren't the desperate, half-starved defenders we had been fighting on other islands. These were veterans of the China campaign, well-supplied and fighting from prepared positions they had spent months perfecting. I crawled behind a fallen log and tried to assess the situation. From the sound of the gunfire, we were facing at least a company of Japanese soldiers, maybe more. They were firing from concealed positions all along the hillside, and their interlocking fields of fire made any movement extremely dangerous. Worse, they had the high ground, which meant they could see us even when we thought we were hidden. "Murphy," I called out. "Can you see their positions?" "Negative, sir," came his reply from somewhere to my right. "They're dug in good. Gonna need artillery to root them out." I grabbed the radio handset from Corporal Williams, who was pressed against a tree trunk about 10 feet away. "Tomcat base. This is Tomcat 26 over." "Tomcat 26. This is base. Send your traffic. We're taking heavy fire from concealed positions on Hill 394. Request immediate artillery support on grid reference 779er-428. Enemy strength estimated at company size. Dug in and well supplied." "Roger, 26. Artillery is engaged with targets to your south. Earliest availability is 30 minutes. Can you hold your position?" 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours. The Japanese fire was so intense that we couldn't even lift our heads to return effective shots. Already I could hear voices calling for medics, and I knew we were taking casualties we couldn't afford to lose. But falling back wasn't an option either. The open ground behind us would be a killing field under the enemy's observation. That first engagement on Hill 394 lasted 14 hours. By the time our artillery finally arrived and began pounding the Japanese positions, we had lost 6 men killed and 11 wounded, nearly half my platoon. But when the smoke cleared and we finally fought our way to the top of the hill, we discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about this war. The Japanese hadn't just dug foxholes and bunkers. They had created an entire underground city. Tunnels connected every fighting position, allowing defenders to move unseen from one sector to another. Supply chambers had been carved out of solid rock and stocked with enough ammunition and food to last for months. Medical stations, communication centers, even sleeping quarters, all of it hidden beneath what looked like ordinary jungle terrain. Murphy whispered as we explored the main tunnel complex. "They could have fought from here forever." He was right. The engineering that had gone into this single hilltop was extraordinary. Ventilation shafts provided fresh air while remaining invisible from above. Multiple escape routes led down the back slope of the hill, allowing the garrison to evacuate if their position became untenable. Drainage systems kept the tunnels dry even during the heaviest monsoon rains. This wasn't desperation. This was military engineering at its finest. But what impressed me most was the evidence of discipline and preparation we found throughout the complex. Personal equipment was neatly organized, weapons were clean and well-maintained, and medical supplies were properly stored and labeled. These soldiers had been ready to die for their emperor, but they had also been ready to make us pay a terrible price for every inch of ground we took. As February turned into March, we discovered that Hill 394 was just the beginning. Every significant piece of terrain in northern Luzon had been fortified to the same standard. The Japanese had spent the better part of 1944 preparing for our invasion, and they had used their time well. General Yamashita had divided his forces into 3 groups, each designed to fight a separate campaign that would bleed us white even if we ultimately won. The Shobu Group, which we were facing in the northern mountains, consisted of over 100,000 troops organized into multiple defensive zones. Each zone was designed to delay our advance for weeks or even months, forcing us to pay for every mile with American blood. Behind each zone was another zone, and behind that another, stretching all the way to the northernmost tip of Luzon. Yamashita knew he couldn't win, but he could make victory so expensive that we might reconsider our strategy for the rest of the war. My platoon spent the next month learning to fight this new kind of warfare. Every attack began the same way. Intelligence would identify what appeared to be a minor Japanese outpost. We would advance to clear it. And then we would discover that the outpost was actually a major fortified position defended by hundreds of soldiers who had no intention of surrendering. The fighting was unlike anything we had experienced in the previous Pacific campaigns. On islands like Sapan and Iwo Jima, the Japanese had eventually been forced to make desperate banzai charges that allowed our superior firepower to destroy them in the open. But on Luzon, they never gave us that opportunity. They fought from concealed positions, used the terrain to their advantage, and withdrew to secondary positions only when their primary positions became absolutely untenable. The worst part was the booby traps. The Japanese had turned the entire battlefield into a deadly maze where any object might conceal an explosive device. Abandoned equipment, dead bodies, even seemingly harmless rocks and logs could kill you if you weren't careful. Every step forward had to be calculated, every piece of cover examined before it could be used. The psychological pressure was enormous. We were fighting an enemy we could rarely see, in terrain that tried to kill us even when no one was shooting. Private Morrison stepped on a buried mortar shell on March 15th, and the explosion took his left leg off at the knee. He was a kid from Kansas who had joined the army to see the world, and now he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget what he had seen in the jungles of Luzon. As we waited for the medics to carry him to the rear, he kept asking me why the Japanese wouldn't just surrender like civilized people. I didn't have an answer for him then, and I'm not sure I have one now. What I did understand was that we were fighting an enemy who believed that death with honor was preferable to life with shame. They had been trained from childhood to view capture as the ultimate disgrace, and they would literally fight to the death rather than give up. That kind of fanaticism is terrifying when you're facing it across a battlefield, but it's also self-defeating in the long run. Dead soldiers can't fight future battles, and the Japanese were spending their most experienced veterans in a campaign they couldn't possibly win. By the end of March, the pattern had become clear. We would identify a Japanese position, surround it with overwhelming force, and then systematically destroy it with artillery, airstrikes, and flamethrowers. The defenders would fight to the last man, inflicting casualties on us, but ultimately achieving nothing except their own destruction. Each battle was like a small version of the larger war. We had superior numbers, better equipment, and control of the sea and air, so the final outcome was never in doubt. The only question was how many Americans would die before the Japanese accepted reality. April 1945 was when the campaign on Luzon turned into what the veterans started calling the grinder. By then, we had been fighting continuously for 3 months, and both sides had settled into a brutal routine of attack, counterattack, and attrition. My original platoon of 24 men had been reduced to 8 effectives, with replacements arriving weekly to fill the gaps left by casualties. Some of these new soldiers lasted days, others lasted hours. A few, like Private Rodriguez from Los Angeles, seemed to have been born for this kind of fighting and quickly became invaluable members of the unit. The Japanese were suffering far worse casualties than we were, but they showed no signs of breaking. Intelligence estimates suggested that the Shobu Group had lost over 30,000 men since the campaign began. But the survivors continued to fight with the same intensity as if they had just entered the war. Their supply situation was becoming desperate. We had cut their main supply lines and controlled all the major ports, but they had prepared for this contingency by stockpiling weapons and ammunition in hidden depots throughout the mountains. What amazed me was their ingenuity under pressure. When they ran low on rifle ammunition, they began manufacturing crude but effective explosive devices from artillery shells and aircraft bombs. When their radio communications were jammed by our electronic warfare units, they switched to a system of signal fires and mirror flashes that allowed them to coordinate defensive actions across wide areas. When their medical supplies ran out, they continued fighting with wounds that would have hospitalized American soldiers for weeks. But ingenuity and determination can only go so far against overwhelming material superiority. By mid-April, we were bringing everything we had to bear against the remaining Japanese positions. B-24 bombers flew missions every day, dropping 500-pound bombs on suspected enemy concentrations. Our artillery fired around the clock, with some batteries expending more ammunition in a single day than they had used in entire previous campaigns. Sherman tanks fitted with flamethrowers burned out cave systems and bunker complexes that had resisted conventional weapons. The most effective weapon we had, though, was time itself. The Japanese could replace neither their losses nor their equipment. Every soldier who died was gone forever. Every rifle destroyed was one less weapon available for the defense. We, on the other hand, could bring in fresh troops from the United States, new equipment from American factories, and unlimited supplies to ports we controlled completely. It was a mathematical equation that could have only one solution. The turning point came on April 27th, when elements of the 37th Infantry Division finally broke through the main Japanese defensive line in the Caraballo Mountains. This wasn't just another tactical victory. It was the collapse of Yamashita's entire strategy for northern Luzon. Once we controlled the high ground in the Caraballos, we could interdict the remaining Japanese supply routes and isolate their scattered garrison forces. I was with the lead elements when we reached the summit of Mount Pulog, the highest point in northern Luzon. The view from up there was incredible. You could see for miles in every direction, all the way to the coast where our supply ships waited in Lingayen Gulf. But what struck me most was the evidence of Japanese preparation that was visible from that height. Every valley, every ridge, every stream crossing had been turned into a fortress. They had spent months, maybe years, getting ready for this campaign, and now it was all crumbling around them. The final phase of the campaign began in early May, when General Kruger ordered a coordinated assault on the remaining Japanese strongholds. By then, the Shobu Group had been reduced to perhaps 40,000 effectives scattered across a dozen isolated pockets of resistance. They had no hope of victory, no possibility of reinforcement, and no chance of evacuation. But they continued to fight anyway, because that's what their code of honor demanded. My platoon was assigned to clear out a complex of caves and bunkers near the town of Baguio, which had been the summer capital of the Philippines before the war. Intelligence told us we were facing about 200 Japanese soldiers who had been cut off from their main force for over a month. They had limited supplies, no heavy weapons, and no way to escape. It should have been a straightforward operation that would take a day or two at most. It took us 2 weeks. The cave system was even more elaborate than the ones we had encountered earlier in the campaign. The Japanese had connected natural limestone caverns with hand-dug tunnels, creating a defensive position that extended for nearly a mile underground. Multiple entrances allowed the defenders to shift their positions constantly, making it almost impossible for us to predict where the next attack would come from. Booby traps and mines had been placed throughout the complex, turning every passage into a potential death trap. We tried everything: flamethrowers, satchel charges, even pumping gasoline into the caves and igniting it. But the Japanese had prepared for all of these tactics. Ventilation systems carried away toxic fumes. Blast doors protected critical areas from explosions, and alternate routes allowed the defenders to continue fighting even when major sections of the complex were destroyed. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez discovered a hidden entrance that led directly into the heart of the Japanese position. It was barely wide enough for one man to crawl through, and it was protected by trip wires connected to grenades, but it offered us the chance to get behind the main defensive line. I volunteered to lead a small assault team to the tunnel, knowing that we would probably all die in the attempt, but hoping that our sacrifice might save the lives of the rest of the company. Crawling through that tunnel was the longest 10 minutes of my life. Every few feet, we encountered another booby trap that had to be carefully disarmed in complete darkness. The air was stale and thick with the smell of explosives and human waste. Behind us, we could hear the Japanese defenders firing at our diversionary attack on the main entrance, their voices echoing through the limestone passages like the sounds of ghosts. And ahead of us was nothing but blackness and the certainty that we were crawling toward our own deaths. When we finally emerged into the central chamber of the complex, we found ourselves face to face with about 30 Japanese soldiers who were surprised to see us as we were to see them. For a moment that lasted forever, both sides just stared at each other in the dim light of battery-powered lanterns. Then someone opened fire, and the chamber erupted in muzzle flashes and screaming. The firefight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. In such close quarters, marksmanship mattered less than reflexes and luck. The Japanese fought with bayonets and samurai swords when their ammunition ran out, and several hand-to-hand combats developed in the narrow side passages. I shot one enemy soldier at point-blank range with my Thompson, then turned to find another one charging at me with a grenade in each hand, the pins already pulled. Rodriguez tackled him from the side just as the grenades exploded, saving my life at the cost of his own. When the smoke cleared, all 30 Japanese defenders were dead, and my assault team had been reduced to 3 effectives. But we had broken the backbone of their defense, and within hours the rest of the company was able to clear out the remaining pockets of resistance. The battle for the Baguio caves was over, but the cost had been terrible. Out of the company of 120 men that had started the operation, only 67 were still fit for duty. By June 1945, the campaign on Luzon was effectively over, though scattered groups of Japanese soldiers would continue fighting until the war ended in August. The Shobu Group, which had started the campaign with over 100,000 men, had been reduced to perhaps 5,000 survivors hiding in the most remote areas of the island. The Kembu Group, which had defended Clark Field and the approaches to Manila, had been completely destroyed in February and March. The Shimbu Group, which had fought so desperately for the Philippine capital, had been eliminated in brutal urban warfare that left Manila in ruins but cleared the Japanese from one of the most important cities in Southeast Asia. The numbers were staggering. According to the final casualty reports, the Japanese had lost over 200,000 soldiers killed or missing on Luzon. This included not only frontline combat troops, but also service personnel, Korean laborers who had been pressed into military service, and civilian volunteers who had been organized into militia units. Entire divisions had simply disappeared from the Japanese order of battle, their personnel either dead or scattered as individuals trying to survive in the jungle. American casualties had been significant but manageable by the standards of Pacific warfare. We had lost about 8,000 killed and 36,000 wounded, serious numbers that represented the destruction of many fine units and the deaths of thousands of young men who would never see their homes again. But in the context of what we had accomplished, the liberation of the largest and most important island in the Philippines, the destruction of the Japanese 14th Area Army, and the elimination of any possibility that Japan could mount a successful defense of the home islands, the price had been worth paying. What struck me most about the final weeks of the campaign was the contrast between American and Japanese behavior as the end approached. Our soldiers, knowing that victory was certain, began to focus on survival, taking fewer risks, being more careful about reconnaissance, calling for artillery support rather than attempting costly frontal assaults. We had learned that dead heroes couldn't enjoy the victory parades, and everyone wanted to live to see the war's end. The Japanese, on the other hand, seemed to fight with even greater intensity as their situation became hopeless. They launched desperate night attacks against positions they had no chance of taking, expended their last ammunition in futile gestures of defiance, and died in place rather than attempt to escape to fight another day. From our perspective, this behavior was not only tragic, but also pointless. They were throwing away lives that could have been saved by a simple decision to surrender. But I think I understand now, decades later, why they made the choices they did. They weren't fighting for military victory anymore, if they ever had been. They were fighting for their conception of honor, for their duty to their emperor, and for their belief that a warrior's death was preferable to a life of shame. These weren't necessarily rational calculations from our point of view, but they were profoundly meaningful to the men who made them. In their own way, they were as heroic as any American soldier who charged a machine gun nest or threw himself on a grenade to save his comrades. The formal end of the Luzon campaign came on July 4th, Independence Day, when General MacArthur announced that all organized Japanese resistance on the island had been eliminated. There would still be mopping up operations for weeks to come, and individual Japanese soldiers would continue to be encountered for months. But the major fighting was over. The Philippines had been liberated, and Japanese power in Southeast Asia had been broken forever. I was standing on a ridge overlooking the Cagayan Valley when word of MacArthur's announcement reached us by radio. The valley stretched out below us like a green carpet, peaceful and beautiful in the afternoon sun. It was hard to believe that this landscape had been the scene of some of the most savage fighting in the Pacific War, that hundreds of thousands of men had died in these mountains and jungles, that the innocent-looking villages scattered across the valley floor had been transformed into battlefields where civilized men had done terrible things to each other. My platoon, what was left of it, was scheduled to be pulled back to a rest area near Manila, where we would be re-equipped and brought up to strength with replacement personnel. From there, we would probably be assigned to participate in Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Intelligence estimates suggested that we would face even fiercer resistance there than we had encountered on Luzon, with casualties that might run into the millions. The Japanese had 4 million soldiers available for the defense of their homeland, and they would be fighting on terrain they had known since childhood. None of us looked forward to that prospect. We had seen enough killing to last several lifetimes, and the thought of starting the cycle all over again on an even larger scale was almost unbearable. We were soldiers, and soldiers go where they're ordered to go. If the war continued, we would continue to fight until it was won or until we were all dead. That was what we had signed up for when we put on the uniform. As it turned out, we never had to invade Japan. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August convinced Emperor Hirohito that further resistance was futile, and Japan surrendered on September 2nd. The war was over, and those of us who had survived could finally go home. But the memories of what we had seen and done on Luzon would stay with us forever. 60 years have passed since the Battle of Luzon ended, and I am now an old man with grandchildren who have never known war. Sometimes they ask me to tell them stories about my experiences in the Pacific, and I try to explain what it was like to be young and afraid and very far from home in a place where death could come at any moment from any direction. But I'm not sure they really understand, and perhaps that's for the best. Each generation should face its own challenges without being burdened by the traumas of the past. What I want them to understand, though, is that the victory we achieved on Luzon was not inevitable. It came at an enormous cost in human life and suffering, and it required qualities of courage, endurance, and determination that were tested to their absolute limits. The Japanese soldiers we fought were not the caricatures portrayed in wartime propaganda. They were skilled, dedicated, and incredibly brave men who fought for their beliefs with a tenacity that commanded respect even from their enemies. The American victory on Luzon was the result of superior logistics, overwhelming firepower, and the industrial capacity of a nation that could replace its losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. But it was also the result of individual acts of heroism by thousands of ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Men like Rodriguez, who died saving his comrades in a limestone cave, like Murphy, who somehow survived the entire campaign and went home to raise a family in Montana, like Private Morrison, who lost his leg to a booby trap, but never lost his determination to see the war through to its conclusion. The Battle of Luzon demonstrated both the effectiveness of American military power and its limitations. We could destroy any enemy force that stood against us in conventional combat, but we could not force our enemies to surrender simply by inflicting casualties upon them. The Japanese fought to the death because they believed their cause was just and their honor required such sacrifice. We fought to win because we believed freedom and democracy were worth defending, no matter what the cost. In the end, both sides got what they were fighting for. The Japanese achieved the honorable death they sought, dying for their emperor and their conception of duty. The Americans achieved the victory they needed to secure the future of democratic government in the Pacific. But the price paid by both nations was terrible, and the scars left by the campaign would take decades to heal. The 65,000 Japanese soldiers who died on Luzon were not just statistics in a military history. They were sons and husbands and fathers who would never return to their families. They were teachers and farmers and shopkeepers who had been transformed by war into killers and had died far from everything they loved. Their sacrifice may have been futile from a strategic perspective, but it was deeply meaningful to them and to the families who mourned their loss. The 8,000 Americans who died on Luzon were equally real, equally mourned, and equally deserving of remembrance. They died not for abstract concepts like democracy and freedom, but for their buddies in the foxholes beside them, for the folks back home who were counting on them to finish the job, and for the simple belief that some things are worth fighting and dying for. Their victory made possible the world we live in today, a world where wars between major powers have become unthinkable, and where most of humanity enjoys freedoms that would have seemed impossible in 1945. As I write these words in my study, surrounded by photographs of men who died 70 years ago, I am struck by how young we all were and how little we understood about the forces that had shaped our lives. We thought we were fighting a war against fascism and militarism, and in a sense we were. But we were also fighting the last campaign of the old world, the final battle of an era when nations could still believe that military conquest could solve their fundamental problems. The atomic bombs that ended World War II also ended the age when conventional military campaigns, like the Battle of Luzon, could determine the fate of nations. The destructive power unleashed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki made it clear that future wars between major powers would not be decided by the courage of individual soldiers or the skill of their commanders, but by technological capabilities that could destroy entire civilizations in a matter of hours. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of the Luzon campaign, not that Americans could fight and win against determined enemies, but that such victories had become too costly to be sustainable in an age of weapons of mass destruction. The courage and sacrifice displayed by both sides on Luzon would always be admirable, but the kind of warfare that produced such courage and sacrifice had become obsolete before the campaign even ended. Today, when I read about conflicts in distant parts of the world, I am reminded of those months in the jungles and mountains of northern Luzon, when every day brought new challenges and every night brought new fears. War remains a constant in human affairs, but its character has changed in ways that would be almost unrecognizable to the soldiers who fought on both sides of the Pacific conflict. Modern warfare is faster, more technological, and in some ways more impersonal than what we experienced in 1945, but the fundamental human elements remain the same. Soldiers still face fear and overcome it through training and camaraderie. They still make sacrifices for causes larger than themselves. They still struggle with the moral complexities of taking human life in pursuit of larger goals, and they still carry the memories of what they have seen and done for the rest of their lives, trying to make sense of experiences that can never be fully understood by those who were not there. The Battle of Luzon was both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of Japanese military power in Southeast Asia and the beginning of American hegemony in the Pacific. It was the end of the old style of warfare based on massive infantry campaigns and the beginning of the nuclear age, when the threat of total destruction would prevent such campaigns from occurring between major powers. Most importantly for those of us who participated in it, it was the end of our youth and the beginning of our adult understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to each other when great principles are at stake. If there is a single lesson I would want future generations to learn from our experience on Luzon, it would be this: victory in war, no matter how complete or justified, always comes at a price that is almost too terrible to bear. The 65,000 Japanese soldiers who died defending their homeland were human beings with hopes and dreams and families who loved them. Their deaths may have been necessary to achieve our larger goals, but they were still tragic losses that diminished all of humanity. War should never be entered into lightly, and victory should never be celebrated without remembering what it cost to achieve. The men who died on both sides of the Battle of Luzon deserve to be remembered not as heroes or villains, but as human beings who found themselves caught up in forces larger than any individual could control or fully understand. They did their duty as they saw it, and they paid the ultimate price for their service. We who survived have a responsibility to ensure that their sacrifice meant something, that the world they died to create is worthy of the price they paid for it. The jungles of Luzon have long since grown back over the battlefields where we fought. The bunkers and tunnels that cost so many lives to capture have been reclaimed by vegetation and time. The villages that were destroyed in the fighting have been rebuilt, and new generations of Filipinos live and work in places where American and Japanese soldiers once killed each other with desperate intensity. But the memories remain, and the lessons learned in those green hills continue to resonate through the decades. We learned that courage and determination, while admirable, are not enough to guarantee victory. We learned that technological superiority, while important, cannot replace the human qualities that ultimately decide the outcome of conflicts. Most importantly, we learned that war, regardless of its necessity or its outcomes, leaves scars on everyone it touches, winners and losers alike. As I close this account of the Battle of Luzon, I want to return to that moment when I first realized what we were really fighting for. It wasn't when we landed on the beaches of Lingayen Gulf, or when we broke through the Japanese defensive lines in the Caraballo Mountains. It was much simpler than that. It was when I saw Rodriguez throw himself on that Japanese grenade to save the rest of us, giving up his life without a moment's hesitation, because he knew it was the right thing to do. That's what we were fighting for, not territory or resources or national prestige, but the right to live in a world where people like Rodriguez could make such choices freely, where sacrifice for others would be honored and remembered, where the better angels of human nature could prevail over the darker impulses that lead to war. We won that fight on Luzon at the cost of 65,000 Japanese lives and 8,000 American ones. Whether we have proven worthy of their sacrifice in the decades since is a question each generation must answer for itself.